The only thing I clearly remember is the speedometer dropping too fast while the truck was already out of alignment in the right lane. I wasn't reacting to a car or an animal crossing the road or heavy traffic. The reason was minor, almost insignificant. Even so, it was enough to cause 40 tons to lose momentum in the middle of an empty Florida highway. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late to simply accelerate and continue driving as if nothing had happened. The problem is that the consequence came first. Even before I understood what had caused that deceleration, I was already stopped on the wide shoulder when I noticed the strange movement a few meters behind me, near the exact point where I had slowed down. It wasn't traffic forming a queue or curious onlookers trying to help. It was people who seemed to have been waiting for that specific moment to happen. And at that instant it became clear that the object on the road had never been there by accident. That morning's route was one of the simplest I'd driven all month. Leaving Tampa, heading north to Florida, a light load of medical supplies packed on pallets securely fastened inside the truck bed. Nothing urgent, but it also wasn't cargo that could be left sitting around for long in some strange place. The highway was open, with few distant lights from small towns and that kind of spaced-out traffic where each truck appears in the rearview mirror as a point of light, long before it actually gets close. The clock on the dashboard showed a little after 2 in the morning when I entered that emptier stretch of highway. It was the kind of wide road where the streetlights disappear for miles, leaving only the road reflectors and the constant glare of headlights on the asphalt. There was practically no one around. Every now and then a car would appear quickly in the left lane, pass by, and disappear into the darkness ahead as if fleeing from something. I had been driving for a few hours since my last stop at a large gas station near Lakeland. Full tank, cheap coffee bought at the counter, and that normal feeling of the road flowing smoothly. The truck was stable, the engine running clean, and there were no warning lights on the dashboard. Everything seemed as expected for that kind of simple overnight trip, with no tension or any sign that anything out of the ordinary could happen on that particular stretch of road. The strange detail, looking back now, is that a few miles before that point, I had passed 2 trucks parked on the wide shoulder of an old exit. They weren't broken down, because their headlights were off, and neither had an emergency triangle set up on the road. They also didn't seem to have drivers sleeping inside the cab. At the time, I just slowed down a little as a precaution, and continued my journey without thinking too much about it. What stuck in my mind afterward was another small thing that seemed irrelevant at the time. None of those trucks returned to the highway after I passed. In the mirror, I continued to see the empty shoulder behind me for several minutes, as if they were just waiting for something to happen on that stretch of road. A few miles past that point where the trucks were stopped, the road became completely empty again. Only the constant sound of the engine, the wind hitting the side of the truck bed, and the repeated glint of the reflective strips passing under the truck. I was maintaining a steady speed in the right lane when something small appeared in the beam of the headlights a few meters ahead. It didn't look like an animal. It didn't look like a piece of a blown tire, nor a box fallen from some vehicle. It was a dark object, too low to identify quickly, but large enough not to risk running over it without knowing what it was. On an open road, anything hard on the road can destroy a front tire or burst the suspension. Instinctively, I took my foot off the accelerator and began to carefully reduce speed. It wasn't a sudden braking, just that controlled deceleration that any truck driver does when something strange appears on the asphalt. As I approached, the headlights finally illuminated the object better. It looked like something metallic, perhaps part of a heavy tool or some piece of equipment that had fallen from a pickup truck. It was exactly in the middle of the right lane, positioned in a way that was too strange to have simply rolled there. The position seemed almost aligned with the lane, as if someone had placed it there with some specific intention. At that point, I had to make the quick decision that every driver knows well. Either I changed to the left lane without knowing if a fast car was coming from behind, or I went slowly trying to swerve at the last minute. The rearview mirror was clear, with no oncoming headlights. Even so, I didn't like the idea of throwing the entire truck to the left in that dark stretch. So I continued to slow down, planning to get around the object with the least possible risk. It was precisely at that moment that something started to feel out of place. In the side mirror, a distant light appeared, appearing too quickly on the road behind me. It wasn't a heavy truck or an ordinary car maintaining a constant speed. That light was accelerating sharply towards me, as if the driver already knew exactly where I was going to slow down. When the light behind me in the mirror intensified, I was almost past the object on the road. I swerved slightly to the left without completely leaving the lane, and the truck passed it just inches away. At the last second, I managed to see it better in the headlight beam. It wasn't a car part or a lost tool. It looked like a short metal bar with something attached to the ends, as if it had been prepared to prevent it from rolling off the road. The detail that made me uncomfortable came right after I passed that point. Looking in the side mirror, I could see the bar staying exactly where it was, motionless in the same spot on the lane. It didn't move an inch with the truck's air displacement. Any piece of light metal would have been dragged or at least spun on the asphalt. It looked heavy and deliberately positioned to remain there waiting for the next vehicle. The light that was behind me approached too quickly for that time of the morning. In less than half a minute, it was right next to my rear bumper. It didn't try to overtake immediately, nor did it slow down to maintain a safe distance. It just stayed there behind me, maintaining almost the same speed as me, as if it were observing what I would do after I had slowed down because of the object. That's when I noticed something else strange in the larger rearview mirror of the cabin. Further behind that main light, there was another pair of headlights appearing on the road, still distant but aligned exactly in the same lane. Two vehicles coming from the same point on the highway, appearing right after I slowed down in that empty stretch. The coincidence seemed too small to be a real coincidence. At that moment, I began to mentally piece together the fragments that hadn't made sense a few minutes before. The two trucks stopped on the shoulder, the object positioned in the middle of the lane, and now two vehicles appearing just as I slowed down. I still couldn't say for sure what was happening, but the feeling was clear. That deceleration, which seemed like a simple safety measure, might have been exactly what someone was expecting me to do. The consequences began even before I decided what to do about the situation. The vehicle that had been tailgating me finally left its lane and passed on the left, but it didn't continue on its way as any driver would at that moment. It slowed down just ahead of the truck and began to slowly position itself in front of me, taking up enough space to prevent me from simply returning to the normal speed of the highway. At the same time, in the right mirror, another movement appeared where before there had only been darkness on the shoulder. A low vehicle emerged from an almost invisible service entrance on the side of the highway and began to follow the truck on the right, maintaining a distance that was too short for that speed. They weren't trying to overtake or leave the area. The two vehicles were simply adjusting their positions as if they already knew exactly where each should be. It was at that moment that I truly understood the reason for that object placed on the road a few seconds earlier. It wasn't a trap to puncture tires or cause a direct accident. It was simply meant to force trucks to reduce their speed at that specific point on the highway. Whoever had prepared it knew that a heavy truck doesn't accelerate back down that quickly, and those vehicles were taking advantage of exactly that slight loss of speed. The car in front of me continued to gradually slow down until it forced me to a speed that no truck could maintain on an open highway. I still had room to brake safely, but accelerating and getting out of there wasn't so simple with that vehicle occupying the lane. In the right mirror, the other car was driving parallel, keeping enough distance not to touch but too close to allow any smooth maneuver. It was at that moment that I noticed a third movement further back, almost out of the normal reach of the rearview mirror. One of the trucks I had seen stopped on the shoulder several miles earlier was now entering the highway again. Its lights appeared in the distance, exactly in the direction of that stretch where I had slowed down. It wasn't coming fast, nor was it trying to catch up with the group. It was simply returning to the lane as if it were all part of a planned rhythm. I then realized that it wasn't an immediate robbery attempt or a direct approach. The objective seemed different, simpler, and at the same time stranger. They just needed some trucks to slow down at that specific point on the highway, enough to identify the cargo, license plate, or some other detail before letting the vehicle continue its journey. And at that moment, it became clear that I had just entered this kind of selection process without knowing it. After a few minutes at that strange speed, the car in front of me simply accelerated and left the left lane without looking back. The vehicle that was coming alongside on the shoulder slowed down until it disappeared in the right rear view mirror, returning to the same service entrance from which it had emerged. There was no attempt to stop the truck, no gesture, no sign of approaching. The highway returned to its normal silence, as if nothing had happened in that stretch. I continued driving for several miles before finally easing off the wheel. When I looked at the fleet's GPS a few minutes later, I noticed that my speed had dropped exactly at the point on the road where that metal bar was placed. Coincidence, perhaps. But the deceleration mark was right in the middle of an isolated stretch of highway, far from large gas stations or toll cameras. Since then, when I see any object that's too small stopped in the middle of an empty highway in the early morning hours, I don't slow down as much as I used to, because now I know that sometimes the danger isn't in what's on the road, it's in whoever put it there hoping someone would slow down. If you're a fan of these stories, do me a solid. Hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment below. It tells the YouTube algorithm to push this video out to more people. I appreciate the support. The man already had his inspection pad open when I got out of the truck, standing next to the cab door as if he'd been waiting for that exact moment. He was wearing a dark jacket with state transport identification and maintained that direct tone of someone who conducts this type of inspection all day at rest stops. The problem was that I hadn't seen any patrol car enter the parking lot before he showed up. He first pointed to the DOT number on the side of the truck and started writing something down without even asking my name or my route. That was strange enough, but what really caught my attention was something smaller. The car parked a few meters behind him had no visible official markings. Just an ordinary sedan, engine running, headlights off. As he continued talking about quick compliance checks, I noticed a detail that no driver forgets after years on the road. He was holding the inspection pad the wrong way, like someone who had seen it before but never actually used it during an official stop. And at that moment, the feeling became very clear. It looked like authority, but it didn't look like a real inspection. I had stopped at that Georgia rest stop more out of road discipline than real necessity. The digital clock in the cab was approaching the mandatory rest window, and the parking lot still had plenty of free space between the trucks. It was one of those common spots on southeastern highways, with bright lighting, vending machines in the center, and a few trucks lined up silently, while the drivers slept inside their cabs. The cargo on that trip was simple. Pallets of automotive parts leaving Alabama bound for a warehouse further north. Nothing sensitive, nothing that required an escort or special care beyond the basics. The cargo hold was intact. All the documentation was organized in the folder next to the seat, and the ELD, electronic logistics device, was recording normal driving time. It was exactly the kind of relaxed stop where the driver just stretches his legs and returns to the cab a few minutes later. When I turned off the engine, the parking lot looked perfectly normal. 2 refrigerated trucks further back, an empty flatbed near the trees, and another tractor without a trailer occupying 3 spaces near the restroom area. Nothing out of the ordinary. Even the passenger cars were parked in the area reserved for smaller vehicles away from the truck maneuvering area. The only thing I noticed, almost reflexively, was a dark sedan parked slightly out of alignment near the rest stop exit. It wasn't illegal to park there, but it also wasn't exactly the kind of spot where someone would normally leave a car to rest overnight. The interior lights were off, and the car seemed empty as I walked past towards the truck. A few minutes later, when I returned to the cabin to retrieve the document folder, that same sedan was still in the same spot. Only now the engine was running, and the driver's door was open. And the man leaning against my truck didn't look like he'd stepped out of any official vehicle. He remained standing by the cab door as if the inspection had been underway for some time. As I approached again, he lifted the pad and pointed to the side of the truck, saying he needed to confirm some DOT registration data before proceeding. His tone was calm, direct, exactly the kind of voice agents use when conducting quick inspections at rest stops in the early morning hours. I opened the cab door and grabbed the folder where I keep the basic trip documentation: license, company registration, truck and cargo information. While I was doing this, I noticed that he wasn't observing the cab or looking inside the truck as normally happens in real inspections. Instead, his eyes quickly scanned the side of the cargo area, the seal on the rear door, and then returned to the form he was pretending to fill out. When I handed over the documents, he only glanced at the first page, like someone who already knows what he's looking for before even reading anything. He didn't ask for the electronic log, didn't inquire about driving hours, and didn't mention any specific inspection code. He just said it was a quick routine check because of some irregularities that had appeared in loads passing through that route. At that moment, I had to make the decision that every truck driver knows when faced with an unexpected inspection. Either you fully cooperate and let the person conduct the process, or you start asking questions that might irritate someone who actually has authority there. The problem is that the more he talked, the more small details didn't match any inspection I had already undergone on the road. That's when I noticed another detail that until then seemed too small to matter. The sedan that had been parked near the rest stop exit had moved a few meters since the last time I'd looked. Now it was positioned facing the truck parking area, with the engine still running and someone sitting in the driver's seat directly observing the inspection. As he continued flipping through my documents, I began to look more closely at the details of the uniform. The jacket had an emblem similar to those found in transport inspections, but the fabric looked too new, almost without wear. In real inspections, agents usually wear reflective vests or some kind of clear identification when approaching parked trucks at night. There was nothing reflective here, just that dark jacket and a badge attached somewhat crookedly. He then asked to check the seal number on the truck bed. He said this quickly, as if it were an automatic part of the procedure. We walked a few steps to the back of the truck, and he illuminated the door with a small flashlight he took from his pocket. The strange thing was the way he held the light. Instead of focusing directly on the seal, he slowly swept the beam across the entire door of the truck bed, as if he were looking for something beyond the numbering. When he read the number in a low voice, he wrote it down in his notepad and looked back at the parking lot. Not at me. The sedan was now a little closer, parked so that its headlights were aligned with the row of trucks. Still, it still had no official identification, no traffic lights, and no markings from any state agency. That's when he said something that didn't make sense in that context. He said he needed to confirm the registered cargo before releasing the truck to continue its journey. That didn't match what was happening. I was voluntarily stopped at a rest stop, not at a way station or highway checkpoint. At that moment, I realized he wasn't trying to issue a fine nor conduct a full inspection. He was trying to gather information about that specific truck, mainly about what was inside the cargo area. And the person inside the sedan seemed interested in exactly the same thing. It was when he returned to the side of the truck that something finally deviated from the script he seemed to be following. Instead of continuing to look at the documents or asking for the electronic log, he directly asked exactly what type of cargo was inside the truck bed. He didn't ask for the shipment code or the destination company, just the contents in a generic way. That was already strange enough for any driver who had ever been through real inspections. I responded as neutrally as possible, simply stating that they were sealed automotive parts registered on the cargo manifest. He jotted something down on the notepad without actually checking the corresponding document. Meanwhile, the sedan in the parking lot moved again a few meters, now lined up almost directly behind the truck, as if the driver were trying to get a view of the rear door. At that moment, another small thing happened that completely changed the situation. A truck parked 2 spaces ahead suddenly started its engine and turned on all the exterior lights in its cab. The entire parking lot became brighter for a few seconds, and the light shone directly on the jacket of the man who was with me. That's when it became clear that the emblem on the uniform didn't match the actual format used by the DOT in that state. The symbol looked correct at first glance, but the design was slightly different from the standard that any trucker accustomed to inspections would immediately recognize. And at that moment, the appearance of authority began to crumble very quickly. When the bright light from the other truck illuminated the entire parking lot, the man noticed at the same time I had noticed the detail on the emblem. He closed the inspection pad too quickly, like someone who had lost control of a situation that until then seemed comfortable. He didn't try to continue the conversation or ask for more documents. He just said he was going to check something else on the official vehicle. He walked straight toward the sedan that was parked a few meters behind my truck. There were no marked police cars, no traffic lights, just that ordinary car with its engine running from the start. As soon as he opened the passenger door, the vehicle immediately began moving toward the rest stop exit without excessive haste, but also without any attempt to appear as if an official stop had been completed. A few minutes later, a driver who had just gotten out of the truck ahead approached, asking if that had been a real inspection. He had also noticed the strange activity in the parking lot. The difference was that he was on a call with another truck driver from the same company at that moment, and the conversation ended up reaching a contact who had a direct line to the State Highway Patrol. Less than 20 minutes later, 2 real patrol cars showed up at the rest stop and started asking questions about what had happened there. The pattern described was already known to them. People using fake DOT identification to collect information about specific cargo during the early morning hours. It wasn't an inspection. It was target reconnaissance. Since then, whenever I stop at overnight rest stops in Georgia, I've developed a new habit I didn't have before. Before even getting out of the cab, the first thing I look at isn't the truck next to me. It's whether there are any visible police vehicles anywhere in the parking lot. After the vehicles left the rest stop, the parking lot returned to its usual early morning silence. Trucks with their engines off, some refrigerated ones vibrating softly at the back of the yard, and a few lights on in the rest area. The whole situation had lasted less than half an hour, but the feeling that something bigger was happening there was very clear to anyone who had witnessed the operation from the beginning. The police recorded the basic details: a description of the man, the sedan, the approximate time, and the position where the car was parked. None of us had a complete license plate or a clear image of the driver inside the car. To them, this already seemed to be part of something that had been happening at certain specific stopping points in the region, always involving trucks that stopped alone during the early morning hours. The following morning, when I resumed my journey and passed the first open way station on the route, I mentioned what had happened to a real DOT agent. He listened without seeming surprised and simply confirmed that there had been similar reports in recent months. People trying to impersonate inspectors to find out specific truck cargo, destinations, and schedules. The curious thing is that none of these approaches end right there in the parking lot. Those who do this sort of thing are usually not interested in stopping the truck at that moment. They just want to know enough to decide if it's worth encountering that same truck again, further down the road. Since that early morning, whenever someone shows up near the booth saying it's a quick inspection outside of a way station or official checkpoint, I don't immediately open the document folder like I used to. First, I look for the patrol car, because real authority never arrives alone in a regular sedan in the middle of an empty rest stop. The first thing that didn't add up was the trailer's behavior on a simple turn within the industrial area. It wasn't skidding or loss of control, just a strange weight shift that didn't match the load listed on the manifest. Loaded trucks have a predictable way of reacting on turns, and that movement was a few centimeters off the standard that any driver immediately feels at the wheel. I glanced quickly at the dashboard, thinking it might be air pressure or suspension adjustment, but all the indicators were normal. Even so, the trailer continued to respond slightly late to changes in direction, as if something inside the cargo box was reacting differently than expected. It wasn't enough to cause an accident at that moment, but it was the kind of technical detail that starts small and can become a serious problem on the open road. It was when I stopped at the first traffic light outside the yard that I noticed something even stranger. In the side mirror, I could clearly see the metal seal attached to the back door of the truck bed. It was there, seemingly intact, but the position of the closing wire wasn't oriented the way it normally is on a freshly sealed shipment from the warehouse. And that shouldn't have changed on its own during a journey of less than 2 kilometers. The pickup had taken place at an old industrial complex in upstate New York, one of those places where several warehouses share the same large yard full of aligned loading docks. It wasn't the first shipment I'd made there. Usually the process was quick. The truck pulls up to the designated dock, the warehouse staff closes the cargo area, puts on the seal, and hands over the documentation before departure. That night the yard was partially lit, with some areas bright and others practically in the dark between the warehouses. There was enough activity to make it seem normal. Forklifts crisscrossing, 2 trucks waiting to dock, and an empty trailer parked near the back fence. Nothing that would immediately catch the eye of someone focused on lining up their truck and leaving the area. The loading itself was simple. Large boxes of industrial equipment, weight distributed on pallets securely fastened with internal straps. Nothing that could easily move inside the truck. The dock operator closed the rear doors, applied the metal seal, and confirmed the number on the manifest before handing me the folder. I myself quickly checked the seal, as I always do before leaving. After that, I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and began to slowly drive down the narrow corridor leading to the main gate of the complex. It was a short drive, just a few minutes, to reach the industrial road that connects to the nearest highway. The truck seemed normal at that moment, the engine stable, the suspension responding as expected for a loaded trailer. The only unusual detail about that exit was that the access gate was partially open and there was no one in the guardhouse at that moment. Normally, the security guard is there registering trucks entering and leaving the complex. That night, the cabin was empty when I passed by, and just behind the fence in the darkest part of the yard, there was a parked vehicle that didn't seem to belong to any of the transport companies operating there. As I passed through the gate and entered the industrial street, I still wasn't sure if the trailer's strange behavior was just an impression caused by the uneven pavement of the yard. Older industrial areas often have patches in the asphalt that make any truck seem unstable for a few seconds. Even so, I kept my speed low as I drove through the first few blocks before reaching the main avenue that led to the highway. On the second right turn, the movement happened again. It wasn't the usual lateral swaying of a heavy load. It seemed more like a slight delay in the trailer's response, as if something was shifting position inside the cargo area after the cab had already completed the turn. That shouldn't happen with properly secured pallets. This type of movement usually indicates loose cargo or a change in weight distribution. It was at that moment that I needed to make a quick decision. Either I ignored the detail and continued straight to the highway, assuming it was just an impression caused by the yard floor, or I stopped the truck right there in the industrial area to better investigate what was happening. Stopping meant clearing space on the narrow street and possibly blocking the passage of other vehicles. I continued moving slowly for a few more meters while observing the trailer's behavior in the side mirror. The metal seal was still visible on the rear door, exactly where it should be. That would normally be enough to dispel any suspicion of tampering with the cargo during loading. But then I noticed another technical detail that shouldn't be there. The seal was attached, but the wire that runs through the mechanism was bent at a different angle than the standard used by the dock operators at that warehouse. It was something small, almost invisible to someone who doesn't pay attention to it every day. Even so, it indicated something simple. Someone could have resealed that seal after opening it. I decided not to go straight onto the highway yet. I continued driving slowly through the industrial area, looking for a wider stretch of road where I could stop the truck without blocking traffic. While doing this, I started paying attention to the trailer's behavior with each small steering correction. The delay in response kept appearing, always a few seconds after the cab finished the maneuver. As I passed through a section illuminated by a tall lamppost, I looked again at the wax in the side mirror. It was still there, glistening under the yellow light of the lamppost, seemingly intact to any quick observer. Even so, something didn't quite fit. The metal wire appeared to have been twisted twice in different places, as if it had been removed and repositioned manually. A few meters later, a slight unevenness in the asphalt caused the trailer to react more abruptly. It wasn't a strong jolt, but enough for me to clearly feel that something inside the cargo area had shifted a few centimeters. It didn't look like heavy industrial cargo securely fastened on pallets. It looked like something smaller that had room to move. At that moment, I began to consider a possibility that no driver likes to imagine. If someone had opened that cargo box inside the yard and tampered with the cargo, the tampered seal would explain the strange detail on the wire. But that still didn't explain why the weight was reacting that way on the curves. That's when something else appeared in the cabin mirror. The same dark vehicle I'd seen parked near the fence at the back of the complex was now slowly pulling out down the industrial street a few blocks behind me. It wasn't speeding, nor was it trying to catch up with the truck. It was just keeping a steady distance, as if observing how far I would go before stopping to check the trailer. A few blocks later, I found a wider stretch near a closed loading gate and decided to stop the truck right there. It wasn't an ideal place for inspection, but it was still within the industrial area and away from the heavy highway traffic. As soon as I came to a complete stop, I pulled the parking brake and spent a few seconds looking in the mirrors to see if that dark car would continue passing or if it would make any different move. The vehicle slowed down a few meters behind, and then turned onto another side street without even trying to overtake the truck. That didn't prove anything, but the coincidence was hard to ignore. Even so, I got out of the cab to check the trailer before the technical problem turned into something more serious when I picked up speed on the highway. When I walked to the back of the trunk and shone my cell phone flashlight on the seal, the detail became even clearer. The metal wire was indeed twisted in two different places. It was the kind of mark that appears when someone opens the seal with a thin tool and then tries to close it again so that it appears intact from a distance. The problem was that the seal was still officially closed. This meant that to check the inside of the truck, I would have to break it and then report the incident to the company and the cargo's destination. That alone would mean delays and potential logistical losses. That's when I heard a sharp thud coming from inside the trailer. It wasn't a box falling. It was something heavier hitting the inside wall of the cargo area as if it had just shifted from one side to the other. And at that moment it became clear that continuing to drive without knowing what was happening could turn that technical problem into a real accident. I quickly returned to the cab and moved the truck just a few meters to better align the trailer on that wide stretch of the industrial road. I didn't want to open the cargo box with the truck poorly positioned or tilted, because any shift in weight could worsen the situation. As soon as I stopped again, I turned off the engine and walked to the rear more carefully. I broke the seal using the pliers I always carry in the side box of the cab. The moment I unlocked the right door of the cargo compartment, I immediately felt something inside pressing against the structure. It wasn't the kind of pressure caused by poorly secured pallets. It was something smaller, but heavy enough to push against the door. I opened the door just a few inches first. The flashlight quickly revealed the problem. One of the straps securing the pallets had been cut and several boxes had been moved from their original place. Among them was a heavy metal object that wasn't part of the registered cargo. It looked like an industrial part used as an improvised counterweight. When I removed that object and rearranged the loose boxes, the trailer's strange behavior finally began to make sense. That piece had been positioned loosely between the pallets with enough space to slide a few centimeters at each turn or unevenness. At low speed, this was just a delay in the trailer's response. At highway speed, it could easily cause a loss of stability. I photographed everything before putting the boxes back in place and informed the company, while still stopped on the industrial road. The instruction was clear. File a police report and only continue the journey after completely reorganizing the cargo. This meant a delay in delivery, and part of the cargo ended up damaged during the movement. The damage wasn't total, but it wasn't small either. And it all started with a seal that, seen from a distance, appeared perfectly intact. After rearranging the load and applying a new seal, it took me almost 40 minutes to be sure that everything inside the truck bed was secure again. The damaged boxes were photographed, and the company simply asked me to continue the journey and deliver the rest as normal. When I finally got on the highway, the truck responded exactly as it should on curves and lane changes. Even so, for the first few kilometers I continued driving slower than usual, paying attention to every little reaction of the trailer. When something inside a trailer starts moving the wrong way, the memory of that movement stays with the steering wheel for a long time. Every turn seemed to demand extra attention. Later, speaking with the warehouse manager on the phone, I discovered that the guard booth had indeed been empty for a few minutes that night. The security guard had gone out to check an alarm in another warehouse in the complex. It was precisely during that interval that my truck was parked at the loading dock. The strangest detail is that no one at the warehouse could explain where that heavy metal piece that appeared inside the trailer could have come from. It wasn't part of the warehouse inventory or the equipment used by the dock operators. It simply shouldn't have been there. Since then, when I see a seemingly intact seal after leaving an industrial yard, I don't just trust the number registered on the manifest. Because a seal can remain closed, even after someone has already opened the trailer. To keep these stories coming, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. That engagement is fuel for the channel. It helps YouTube deliver these videos to more folks out on the highway. Stay safe and keep the shiny side up.